This is the Situation Room.
Welcome, everyone. We are in the Situation Room. Colonel Rhett John in the Situation Room. And again, here's somebody else who has a show with a title similar to this, but I can tell you two things. Again, I have a better beard, and I've actually been in the Situation Room at the White House a number of times. So I have a great guest, a special guest today. His name is Dr. John Lott. And if you want to talk any issue related to weapons in our society, and especially statistics, often which are distorted or intentionally by liberal media to portray a picture that actually isn't quite true. The numbers actually don't support what they say if they actually knew the numbers. So I want to bring him in here, and we're going to have a great time here. I'm really looking forward to that. We're going to do two segments, two shows with him. So I'd like to introduce everybody, Dr. John Lott. Here he is.
Appreciate
Dr.
your
Lott.
service.
Hey. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lott. Thank you for your service, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, so Dr. Lott has a great career and history. He knows these numbers inside and out. And this is when we're talking about the Second Amendment rights, it's very important to know the basics of these numbers. I can't tell you how important it is because things like how many people are killed by fists every year versus long rifles. We're going to talk about that. You'd be surprised. Dr. Lott, please introduce yourself. Give everybody a little bit about your background and your service with the Trump first term, please.
Sure. Well, I have a PhD in economics. I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Stanford, the Wharton Business School, University of Chicago, Yale, UCLA. I was chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission, and more recently, I served as senior advisor for research and statistics in the Department of Justice during the Trump administration. So, I basically kind of got a little bit of real world experience there, and some Ivy League or Ivy Tower type experience too on trying to think about these things. But I've done a lot of research on a wide range of crime issues, from policing to vote fraud to gun control type issues. And currently I'm president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, which is a group of academics who do research on a whole range of crime issues. And people can find more about what we do at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lott. Really appreciate it. Now, how did you, just curious, I was actually a Trump appointee, never onboarded. The government lawyer sat on my package for almost a year and a half, contesting a number of issues. How was your experience? And was that your first time in the federal government? And how was your experience? And what are your thoughts and observations during the Trump first term?
Well, I worked in the federal government in the 1980s when I was chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission. This was different. I don't know, I guess each time I end up working in the federal government, it kind of confirms most of my worst fears about how things are operating. But being in the Department of Justice, it was kind of surreal in the sense that people may not know this, but kind of as an olive branch to the Bushes. President Trump let George W. Bush, his people, fill the positions at the Department of Justice, and let Jeb Bush fill the positions at the Department of Education largely. And the problem is that the people that they put in, the Bush people put in, hated Trump. I wasn't there from the beginning of the administration. I was probably wouldn't have gotten in because the Bush people probably wouldn't have pushed for me. In fact, they fought against me when I was asked to go in there. But you had a situation where, for example, David Mulhausen, who was the director of the National Institute of Justice, he gave out 45% more money for firearms research during his first 3 years there than the last 3 years of the Obama administration. And every single dollar that he gave out was to left-wing gun control advocates. And you kind of had a situation where a lot of the political appointees hated Trump so much that they would go and fund research that would go against what he would say, just so they could go and say that, look, even Trump's own Department of Justice disagrees with him on gun control issues. And I mean, I could give you lots of stories. I'll give you one more story from when I was at the Department of Justice. When I agreed to go, one of the things that I wanted to look at was the errors in the NICS background check system, the background check system that people have to go through in order to buy a gun. And, you know, you'll frequently hear from Democrats or gun control advocates that there have been 4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. And that's simply false. What they should say is there have been 4 million initial denials, and about 99+% of those are mistakes. You know, you'll frequently hear that there's 200,000 dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns in any particular year, and maybe there'll only be 20 criminal cases that are brought. Maybe they'll win 12 of those. And the question is, why are they only bringing 20 cases when there are 200,000 people that were stopped for supposedly illegally trying to buy guns? And the reason is pretty simple, is that they're not real cases. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to a felon. And from talking to people over time, it became pretty clear that the people who are most likely to be falsely stopped with these false positives are minorities, particularly law-abiding Black males and Hispanic males. And there's a simple reason for that, and that is people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other Blacks. And 34% of Black males are felons. 18% of Hispanic males are felons, 6% of white males are felons, and 3% of Asian males are felons. So you're more likely to end up getting mistakes where you have large percentages of these groups have prohibited individuals. It's more likely that you'll get names and birth dates confused. And so when I went to the Department of Justice, I wanted to get the data to actually measure the rate that these errors were occurring. So when I got to DC, I talked to the Bureau of Justice Statistics people, and they were interested in looking into this. And they reached out to the FBI, and the FBI came back and said that they weren't interested in looking at this data. And BJS said, well, you know, it's not your job. It's your job to collect the data, and it's our job to go and analyze the data, and we're interested in looking at this. And the FBI came back and they said, well, we can't think of any reason why anybody would want to break down this data by race and sex. And my response was, you guys break down everything by race and sex. What's the big deal here? So we argue back and forth for a couple of weeks, and then they basically go radio silent. You have to understand this is during COVID, and hardly anybody came into the office. I'd come into the office just because I like to go to an office to go and work. On my floor, there was probably like 300 desks. But on most days, I was the only person on my floor or the person on the floor above or below me. So it's not like you could go to somebody's office door and knock on it and get them to go and respond. You know, you'd send them emails and you'd send voicemails and stuff. The BJS people would do that, and the FBI people just wouldn't respond. And then finally, after a long delay, 2 days after the November 2020 election, the FBI people get back and they say, okay, you're going to have to fill out a FOIA request, as a Freedom of Information Act request, to go and get the data. And this is like incredible. I mean, FOIA requests are something that reporters fill out.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, John, we're going to have to take a break. I can't
Okay.
believe you're a government person, and they're asking you to do a FOIA. Is that it? Did I understand?
Right. The BJS to do this. So this is one part of the Department of Justice asking another part of the Department of Justice to do that. And
well, let's come back to this. This is so important. That blows me away. I have so much experience in and out of government with FOIAs, sending FOIAs, receiving FOIAs, and that blows my mind. John,
right.
we'll be right back. This is absolutely fascinating. Everyone, this is Colonel Rhett John. We are in the Situation Room with Dr. John Lott. He is absolutely a statistician extraordinaire who spent time in the DOJ during the Trump years. So we'll be right back. We are back in the Situation Room. This is Colonel Rhett John. I have a very special guest, Dr. John Lott, who was the senior statistician at the Department of Justice during the Trump years, looking into gun violence issues, and he's just found out so many things. And this thing that just blew me away. I can't believe that you, as at this time, you were a sworn government official. It doesn't matter. People say he was political. Doesn't matter. He's a sworn. You were a sworn government employee. And another part of the government is asking you to do a FOIA to get the data. I've seen some great passive aggressive behavior in slow rolling the sharing of information. I have never heard that one where another government agency asked me to submit a FOIA. That is just
well,
stunning.
Nobody else had heard of something like that happening. But to make it even worse, the FBI data people said, look, even if you can get the FOIA request in today, there's no way we're going to be able to handle this until after January 20th. And they were sure that the Biden administration would be uninterested in looking at this data. So there was really no reason to put in the FOIA request. So anyway, the BJS people argue with them for a couple weeks, and then they go radio silent again. And I get a call from my friend Grover Norquist, who is kind of inside the Beltway conservative muckety-muck there in D.C. Grover and I wrote a book a little bit over a decade ago, and I know Grover pretty well. And anyway, he was supposed to meet with Mark Meadows the next day. Mark was chief of staff for the White House, who I know a little bit. And Mark wanted to know what things the Trump administration could still accomplish in the Department of Justice before the end of the administration. So I give Grover two ideas. One of them is the one we've just been talking about. And Grover meets with Mark, and it's my understanding that Mark was like both of my ideas, and he told Grover that on Monday he was going to contact Bill Barr, the AG, Attorney General, and say that the White House wanted the Department of Justice to do three things. Two of them were mine. So it's my understanding that Mark contacted Bill, and that Bill then reached out to the people at the FBI and told them to stop goofing around and to work on these things. And almost immediately, the Politico, which is kind of the inside the Beltway political publication, a lot of old Washington Post reporters, had a top of their website page story saying, with extra big letters, saying controversial pro-gun researcher joins Department of Justice. So apparently what happened was, as soon as Bill contacted the FBI people went immediately to the media and complained about having to work with me. And it was my understanding at that time that the Department of Justice was just deluged with emails and phone calls from gun control people demanding that I be fired right away. And I don't know how much they got. I know when I had an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 2018, the different gun control groups, I was told by one of the op-ed editors at the New York Times that they had something like 75,000 angry emails within 24 hours. I don't know if exactly. I was told that they hadn't seen so many calls for somebody to be fired as they did with me. And then also there were all these Freedom of Information Act requests from different gun control groups. The PR people at the Department of Justice were completely freaked out. I don't know how many of them told me that they had never seen so many requests for FOIA requests, and basically they just wanted to bog me down with paperwork. And I basically said, look, they're really not different groups. It's like moms demand action, students demand action, every town for gun safety, the Trace. I said, these are all Bloomberg groups. And they pretty much just had a conference call to saying, you asked for this, you asked for that. Anyway, after a couple weeks, things began to calm down. And finally, the FBI people were working with the Bureau of Justice Statistics people on the data, and they sent them data on the error rates by race and gender. And the BJS people were looking at, and they said, well, something's wrong here. These numbers aren't adding up. This should be very simple data to put together. It's just like an Excel spreadsheet, just kind of adding up the columns that were there. So the BJS people then went back and contacted the FBI and said something's wrong here. And the FBI people said, oh, we're really sorry. We're going to give you a call. We apologize. We don't know what happened. We'll fix it. We'll get back to you. This is data should take like 10 minutes to put together. And anyway, a week later, they get back and the BJS people look at it again. They said, something's still wrong here. These numbers aren't adding up. They don't make any sense. And they contact the department, the FBI people again, and the FBI people again apologize profusely, saying they don't know what happened. And basically that happened 4 times. The last time that happened was on January 19th. Of course, we're out the door on noon on January 20th. And the Department of Justice ended up putting out its report on the background check system, but the one section on the errors, the Biden administration never included anything on that. So
this is just, wow, John. I tell you, for 4 years, I was given very broad reign. These are during the Obama years. I did almost 40 years in government, both in uniform and as a senior civilian. And I learned in government, there's always 3 phases of a project. The first phase is everybody slow rolls it, hoping that it goes away, that the whole initiative collapses and goes away.
Right.
That's the first phase. The second phase is the first phase is passive aggressive. The second phase is active aggressive, hoping the whole initiative collapses and goes away. The third phase is when they see that you're serious, like you showed, you're not going away, this is going to happen. They embrace and they own it and they run with it, which is a good thing. But in your situation, they were playing with the end of the first term and they were playing that game. But I had a great team for 4 years. We were allowed to measure cybersecurity breaches I did it for the entire Department of Defense and the intelligence community and reported to the White House. And it's amazing. I learned so much. But wow, John, I just can't believe what you went through here. But your data really showed some important things there. I don't think you shared it maybe before we had talked about it a bit, but it showed a great disparity. If you could talk about that, please.
Right. Well, I mean, never got exact data on it. I had been told before, I've been told over the years by people who have been involved in enforcement, who was being prevented from being able to go and get guns. But the mistakes overwhelmingly involve minority males, Hispanic and Black males. So through no fault of their own, they're prevented, they're denied through the background check system simply because they have roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays to people who are actually prohibited from being able to go and own guns. Now, you can appeal, but the vast majority of people who go through the appeal process are going to have hire a lawyer. And you're talking about costs that are like $3,000 on up for something like that. And, basically that means that middle income and poor people who may want to have a gun for protection for themselves and their families, simply, it's not worth $3,000 or more dollars for them to go and appeal the process for a mistake that, has no fault of their own. And the thing is, if private companies had an error rate in doing background checks on employees that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has, they would be sued out of existence under federal law. I mean, if you were to go to a private employer and suggest, well, you should look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays for doing background checks, they would look at you like you were from Mars or something like that, because they would know that it would have huge discriminatory effects. So, for over 20 years, I've been arguing that the federal government should meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet. So gun control people say they support reasonable gun control. And my response is, look, I just want to have reasonable fixes to your gun control. Everybody wants to stop dangerous, prohibited people from buying guns. But if you have a system where over 99% of the people that you're stopping are mistakes, are not really bad people that are there. They're simply law-abiding people who want to get a gun to protect themselves and their families, and that it's overwhelmingly minorities. If my research convinces me of anything, it's basically poor, particularly Blacks, who live in high crime urban areas, who are the most likely victims of violent crime, who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And, these are the very people that these types of mistakes are stopping. I mean, there are other things that one can talk about with regard to problems with the background check system. One is just the cost. When you go and you buy a gun, there's a cost to the background check, but you don't see that because it's in the price of the gun. It's not like a sales tax that gets added on. But when you have these 20 states and the District of Columbia, which have these background checks on the private transfers of guns, and the only service that's being offered is the background check, you see the cost there. So, where they're talking about these types of rules, let's say in Washington, D.C., if I were there with you, John, and let's say I'm going to sell you a gun or give you a gun, we have to go to a licensed dealer to transfer the gun, and it costs $125 to do it. But that may not stop you or I, but $125 may be the difference between whether a poor person who's trying to defend themselves and their family are going to be able to do so. And just give you an idea of how these types of rules are set up. If you or I were in DC or in most of these other states that have these rules, and I'm going to, let's say, give you 4 guns, you think I am giving John 4 guns. And so it should just be one background check because one person giving one other person all the guns. But that's not the way they do it. They require a separate background check on each gun. So rather than $125, you're talking about $500. Now, give me a benign explanation for why you want to have it set up, for why you have to have a separate background check on each gun rather than just the one person who's receiving all those guns at the same time. And, it's the way they set these up is purposely to try to prevent relatively more modest income people from being able to go and obtain guns to protect themselves and their families. It's very racist and it's discriminatory against poor people. But I mean,
Right.
those are what you see with gun control laws generally. I mean, I would say as an economist, there are a couple points to make. One is if you believe that these background checks reduce violent crime, you want to encourage people to do these background checks. Well, you don't encourage people to do these things, to go out of their way to find a licensed dealer to go and transfer the gun. If you make them have to pay $125, that's essentially taxing them. You don't
Yeah,
tax
yeah.
people to encourage them.
John, we're going to have to wrap it up here. Because we're going to do a second show, but in the last 10 seconds here, please finalize your point there. This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
It's just the rules that they have basically make no sense. They discourage people from doing what they claim that they want to do, and they end up just really discriminating and preventing the people who need guns the most from being able to go and obtain them.
Yeah. This is just like, who is the biggest victim of an unsecure southern border? Who is the one who suffers the most?
Yeah.
It's the young black male, young Hispanic male that are the ones who will be criminalized, victimized, lose a job. And same thing here. It's a weaponization of government in another form. So, John, we're going to be right back. This is Dr. John Lott, who, I mean, this man has the numbers and the data and the receipts that discriminate truth from fiction on gun ownership. So we thank you so much. This is Colonel Rhett John in the Situation Room with my special guest, Dr. John Lott. Thank you very much, and we're going to be back with another episode. Welcome. We are in the Situation Room. This is Colonel Rhett John in the Situation Room. I have a very special guest, Dr. John Lott. This is part 2 of a two-part series with Dr. Lott, who this is the man with the numbers when it comes to gun issues. He's actually in the Trump administration. And in the first segment, we had a great discussion of his time inside of the Trump administration and the deep staters who fought him from doing basically his sworn duties and blocked access to data, which as a 40-year veteran of the trench warfare inside a government, this is what happens, unfortunately. That's not the way people should behave. So let's bring in Dr. Lott. And Dr. Lott, thank you so much. Welcome back for part 2.
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I mean, you have so much of the debate political debate on all sorts of issues depends on numbers, and who controls them in various ways controls the debate. And, I get asked sometimes how it is that, you could have the FBI going and spying on a presidential campaign and not have whistleblowers or leakers about that. And, I think basically the answer is you have everybody in the group there who agrees with each other politically. You can unfortunately have those types of things happen. I can't make any comments about the FBI generally, but I can say that at least the people that I interacted with directly or indirectly in the FBI data people, they seem to be pretty much true believers in terms of an agenda that they have. There's other data that I worked with on things like the FBI active shooting reports, which are just filled with errors. And even when you can get people to acknowledge that mistakes have been made, they just absolutely refuse to correct them. And they will fight against any type of report being put out there that would be critical of them in any way. And the thing is, nobody needs to take my word for it. The criticisms I would have on things like the errors in the active shooting reports, I would put out the cases there so people could judge for themselves whether they were missing particular types of cases or not. But, unfortunately, the media is pretty one-sided too. They go and they look, they rely on things that kind of confirm their prejudices on different issues and aren't willing to go and accept criticisms of the FBI data. But the FBI data is used not only by the media, but it's used in court cases all the time, and it's used by academics for going and doing research. So you got bad data in there, and it corrupts the entire political discussion that you have. I mean, I'll give you one simple example. The FBI, so active shooting cases are instances where guns fired in public, not involving some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight over drug turf, anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. And they claim that over the 9 years from 2014 to 2022, that there were 302 of these active shooting cases, and that 14 of those, or about 4.6% of them, involve instances where somebody legally carrying a permanent concealed handgun stopped the attack. I think the rate is closer to 40%, and it's simply because they missed a lot of cases, and all the cases that they missed were cases where people used permanent concealed handguns to stop attacks, or they misclassified some cases that were there. And I also had an argument with them about how to classify these things. So I was saying you also need to break it down by whether or not these are gun-free zones. You're talking about law-abiding citizens and whether they can stop these attacks. You can't expect a law-abiding citizen to stop an attack that occurs in a place where it's illegal for them to go and have guns. And if you look at the data for 2022, for example, you'll find 63%, a little bit over 63% of the active shooting cases in places where people were allowed to carry were stopped by citizens with concealed handgun permits. That's a big difference from 2022, the 6% that the FBI said.
Wow. So, yeah, this is one, and I would like to see legislation for people allowed. We can't indemnify. If you put up a sign that says gun-free zone, I think you should immediately be culpable and suable if a gun incident occurs in your, because you've accepted ownership of the legal responsibility to keep a safe environment. So if somebody puts up a gun-free zone, I'm a concealed carry person. I follow the laws in Virginia, but I think they should take ownership of that. But yeah, so right there, they're skewing the data. So, they say, oh, well, it doesn't stop that many. Well, if it's a gun-free zone, a law-abiding citizen is violating the law. So you don't have somebody there a good person with a gun who can stop a bad person with a gun. This is one thing, always basic things, is it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm using the FBI statistics, not CDC statistics, that we have roughly, I think it's 500 to 1,000 deaths via long rifles. It's long rifle, anything that's not a pistol or a handgun. We have more people die from fists every year than long rifles. It's either more or very, very close. Is that off the top of your head? Is that the case last time I looked at numbers?
If you look over the last 30 years or so, you'll find someplace between 2 and 4% of all the murders in the United States involve rifles of any type. More recently, it's been in the 2% range, so it's been declining over time. In fact, despite what you might think, after the so-called assault weapons ban sunset in 2004, the percentage of murders involving any type of rifle actually declined significantly after that. So, and it actually went up for a little while when the ban was in effect. So but it's a small percentage of the total. The way the media and the way Biden or Obama talked about assault weapons, you'd think that most mass public shootings involve assault rifles, and that's simply not the case. If you look at any type of rifle, over the last 25 years, about 14.9% of the mass public shootings involve solely a rifle of any type. About 56% involve a handgun solely of any type. And it's, in fact, the most deadly attacks aren't with assault rifles or rifles of any type. The most deadly mass public shootings are ones where you have multiple types of weapons being used, handguns, shotguns, and rifles. And just as an aside, quickly, we frequently hear that the United States is somehow unique in terms of mass public shootings, and that's simply false. What people often don't do is adjust for the population differences between countries, because these things occur in many other countries. I mean, if I were to ask you, since 2010, for example, could you name for me, just between Western Europe and the United States, where the worst mass public shootings have been? They've been in Western Europe. You have in November 2015, the concert shooting in Paris, where 130 people were murdered. In Norway in 2011, if you ignore the bombing deaths from the attack then, you had 67 people who were shot to death. Both of those are much higher than any of the mass public shooting attacks that we've had in the United States. But you need to adjust for population differences. In the United States, we have 340 million people. In a country like Germany, even, which is the most populous in Europe, they have 80 million. Well, since 2000, we've had 8 mass public K through 12 school shootings. Germany's had 3. But given that we have more than 4 times the population that Germany has, if you adjust their 3, that's the equivalent of 12 compared to the 8 that we have here in the United States. You look at a country like Finland, which has had 2. Well, they have 5.5 million people in Finland. That's like 1/60th. Or Norway has had 1. They have just over 5 million people in Norway. You adjust for those, they have tremendously higher per capita rates. Nobody would go and compare the number of murders in California with the number of murders in Rhode Island. You'd go and adjust the population.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to have to take a break here, John. Again, they're absolutely distorting willfully the statistics, and thank you for getting them correct. Appreciate that. We all appreciate that. So everyone, this is Colonel Rhett John. We are in the Situation Room, talking about the real statistics on guns and guns violence versus the lies that we're being fed. So this is with Dr. John Lott, who is an expert on these. So we'll be right back. We are back in the Situation Room. This is Colonel Rhett John, and I have a great special guest. Okay, and Dr. John Lott, who was a key statistician inside the Department of Justice, and this man knows numbers inside and out and the truth. John, let's this is where the zealots against gun ownership get it wrong every time. They always say, gun control leads to a safer society, yet that's really not the case. So, I mean, explain their upside down world and what the numbers, like using Chicago, some of the harshest gun control measures in the nation, yet the most violence. So help explain their upside down world and what truth is.
Well, I mean, Chicago has lots of issues. I think the biggest issue in Chicago is just policing. In recent years, you've had someplace in the teens the rate that people are arrested for murder. Compared nationally, where you have about 64% of murders result in an arrest. And we could go on and do many shows on just all the restrictions that they have on police that make it difficult for them to go and do their job. But look, I understand people's desires. They constantly hear about bad things that happen with guns. They rarely hear about defensive gun uses, even though the research indicates that people use guns defensively about 5 times more frequently to stop crime than guns are used to commit crime. But I'll give you a simple fact, and that is every place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns has seen murder rates go up every single time. You'd think out of randomness, once or twice it would go down, and yet every single time it's gone up. We've seen this obviously in the United States in terms of Washington, D.C. and Chicago. Gun control advocates will say, well, those really weren't fair tests. And I suppose my response is, well, if you didn't think it was going to work, it would have been nice if you had told people in advance that you didn't think it was going to work. But, they say, well, criminals could still get guns from the rest of the country, from the rest of Illinois or from Indiana or Wisconsin or from other places like Maryland and Virginia. And that's true, but they could do that beforehand. That doesn't really explain why the murder rates went up. It may explain why they didn't go down as they were predicting. But you look around the world, even whole nations, even island nations that have adopted gun bans, either all guns or all handguns, has seen large, very large, sometimes 3, 4, or 7-fold increases in murder rates after gun bans have been put into effect. And there's a simple reason for that. And this applies to gun control laws generally, not just complete bans. The issue is who's most likely to obey the rules. So if you have a ban, it's basically the most law-abiding good citizens who turn in their guns. You may take a few guns away from criminals, but if you primarily disarm the potential victims, you make it relatively easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. And you would think, if guns on net are bad, it should be very easy to point to lots of places, surely at least one, where a gun ban lowered murder rates or at least even kept them the same. But the fact that you can't, I think, should give some people some pause. But, just take something simple like these gun-free zones that we alluded to earlier. One thing that just drives me nuts is the media's refusal when they go and talk about the diaries or manifestos for these mass murderers to report on why these mass murderers say they pick the targets that they do. You have guys who are suicidal, but they want to get media coverage. They want the world to know that they were here. They feel unappreciated. And they know that the more people they kill, the more media coverage that they're going to get. And they know if they go to a place where their victims are defenseless, they're going to be able to go and kill more people. And so they explicitly, time after time, talk about going after targets where they know their victims are disarmed in gun-free zones. You take the Covenant school shooter from last year in Nashville, Tennessee. They have a diary. The Biden administration has yet to release the diary, but the Nashville police chief was able to look at it before it was turned over to the Biden administration. And he had a press conference the day of the attack saying that murderer was planning on going after another target first, a mall. But when they realized that there were people who had guns there, they decided that to instead go after a soft target like a school. I'll just give you a simple example how these laws that the gun control people backfire. So in Tennessee, they have a gun-free school zone act, which imposes up to 6 years in prison for violating these gun-free zones. 6 years for you or I would completely change our lives. We'd be felons, being in prison for up to 6 years, our whole lives would be completely messed up. But let's say you're the murderer in this case, and let's say the murderer had survived, hadn't been killed by the police officers when they arrived. They'd be facing 6 life sentences or 6 death penalties. Is it really serious to think that, okay, they can accept the 6 life sentences or 6 death penalties, but you take away 6 years from their 7th life, and that would be too much. That, they'd say, okay, that's going too far. That will deter them from going and committing crimes. The point is what economists call marginal deterrence. For law-abiding citizens, it's a huge penalty. For this type of murderer who's already planning on killing multiple people, it's no penalty at all that they're facing. And so all you've done is assure the murderer that they don't have anything to worry about because the law-abiding citizens are going to obey these laws. And and it creates a magnet for these mass murderers to go after people there because they know that they'll be the only person with a gun. And one thing I do disagree with a number of conservatives on is they'll want to have, like at a school or someplace, have one uniformed officer. You've dealt with security issues. If I were to ask you a question, say, would you want to have air marshals in uniform?
Yeah.
I assume you'd say no, right? For a pretty obvious
it's
reason.
It's that uncertainty to the criminal mind. They don't know who the air marshal is.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is very important. I was involved in two different places where it really also educated me. I spent in Bosnia and Afghanistan. We
Right.
would limit guns, and we had actually very precise rules, but we would never fully take away guns because we knew taking away guns would be a death sentence for a family group or a village if they
Right.
were not allowed to defend themselves. So we would have limitations, and when they would be penalized if we said, well, so many long rifles per number of people in this village, and if we found they had twice that, they would, all those weapons would be seized. But we would never take away everything, and we always accommodated self-defense, and it was because we knew it was a death sentence to just take away
Right.
weapons. One of the things they always say, one of the things they always say is, when they're doing gun statistics, they always say, well, red states have high gun rates, but I think you just said Nashville in Tennessee. I think what distorts or perverts the metrics and measurements is it's blue cities within red states that throw the numbers.
Yeah, well, we've gone through and done that exactly as you're talking about. Gavin Newsom kind of got this discussion started. He was looking at the data for 2020, and in that year, the murder rate in states that voted for Biden was about 2 per 100,000 higher than the states that voted for Trump. Strangely, the data for 2021 was already out when he was making those claims, and all the fact checkers and stuff, for some reason, didn't bother looking at the most recent data that was available because, in fact, the opposite was true then. The states that voted for Biden actually had much higher murder rates in 2021 than the states that had voted for Trump. It was like, I think it was like almost 4 per 100,000 higher. But in either of those years, if you even take the 2020 data, as you say, if you look at the counties that voted for Biden versus the counties that voted for Trump, the counties that voted for Biden had much, much higher murder rates per capita. Whether you looked at it in just the Biden states or you looked at it in the Trump states that were there. I'll give you a couple examples. You look at Louisiana, which voted for Trump. They had a murder rate of about 12 per 100,000, which is twice the national average. But it's basically driven by Orleans Parish, where the murder rate was about 50 per 100,000. Or take Missouri, which also is a strong Republican state. You look at St. Louis County. They also have a murder rate that's about 50 per 100,000. You take out those places, and in fact, the murder rates in the rest of the state are low compared to the rest of the country. And so, look, law enforcement is a local issue. How many police you hire is determined locally. The policies that police follow is determined locally. District attorneys are overwhelmingly elected locally. So who do they decide to prosecute, or if they're going to bring charges, or if they're going to ask for bail? Judges are overwhelmingly elected locally. So the sentences that these criminals receive, and particularly if you look at the years 2020, 2021, and 2022, in many urban areas, you had huge percentages of inmates being released from jails. In many places, over half. In some places, even 2/3 of inmates were being released from jail. And this was, even late 2020 through 2022, it was obvious of who the people were at risk from COVID. The people who are in jail are basically 18 to early 30s. These are not people at high risk, and yet they were being released in massive numbers. So it's not rocket science to understand why we had the big increase in violent crime and crime from 2021 and 2022 during that period of time. It's basically you made it so it wasn't risky for criminals to go and commit crime. And many of the worst offenders, in terms of changing it, exactly what you're talking about there. They were in these heavily Democratic areas.
Yeah, well, there's a term that the blue side always has to have a buzzword or phrase, and we only got a couple minutes left here, but the term ghost guns seems to be one of their favorite ones.
Right.
So yeah, give us a real quick, what is a ghost
Sure.
gun and the
Well,
fallacy of this?
right. Well, the term ghost guns is kind of a new term. Basically, homemade guns. We've had homemade guns in North America since even before we became a country. And, they want to go and claim you need to have a serial number and essentially register these guns in order to be able to go and solve crimes. The thing is, registration of guns, even licensing and registration together, they may solve crime in TV shows, but they don't in real life. In theory, if a gun is left at a crime scene and it's registered to the criminal who committed the crime, you could go and trace it back to the criminal. The problem is that crime guns are virtually never left at this crime scene. And the few times that they are, the criminal's been either killed or seriously wounded, so you've caught them anyway. And the once or twice beyond that, they're not registered. And the once or twice that they are registered, they're not registered to the person who committed the crime. So you can go and look at jurisdictions from Hawaii to Chicago to DC to New York to Maryland, which have had registration licensing for decades, spent huge amounts of money, and haven't solved any crimes. The police chief in Honolulu a while ago testified they've had registration licensing since 1960. He could not find one single crime since 1960 that they've been able to solve. And he estimated that it took 50,000 hours worth of police time in Honolulu to go and run the registration licensing program. That's 50,000 hours worth of police time that could be used each year to go and do things that we know work for policing, and instead went to something that solved no crimes.
Yeah, Dr. Lott, we're going to have to hold. This has been absolutely fascinating. How can people get to you? You mentioned a website. Mention that again, please.
Yeah, they can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. It has everything and more that we've been talking about, but I appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Lott. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And everyone, this has been Colonel Rhett John in the Situation Room with the man who knows these numbers, Dr. John Lott. So thank you. We'll see you next time on In the Situation Room.